Hi, I'm Chris from the Paranoids ProdSec team. If you like pretty pictures and data analysis, then you're in for a treat. If you like memes, cute kittens, and AI-generated art, then you're in for the same pretty pictures of data analysis plots too. I brought my fans with me. So, over the course of my career, I've observed that the status quo is often based on happy thoughts and assumptions. I like to mix things up a bit with some data analysis and dumb questions. So the dumb question today is, what's risk? I put this deck together for myself to compose my thoughts, but I'm more interested in your thoughts. So I'll be asking for them via show of hands and Q&A. And I'd like you all to take part. So, pop quiz to warm up. Shout if you know the answer. CVE 2021 44228 is better known as? Yay! Point to the blue team, red team here, all right? Setting context. About 80% of the software in our applications, in our products, is open source, which is in line with industry trends. With that open source comes vulnerabilities, CVEs, and 0 days into our DevOps pipeline, which we'd like to keep out of our products so our customers are not impacted and that attackers can't exploit. We have several tools in our DevOps pipeline that detect these vulnerabilities, but risk remediation at scale is a hard problem. So we're going to do some data analysis and see if we can make life easier for our users by telling them which vulnerabilities they need to fix first. A lot of what we talk about here applies to infrastructure and third-party products, but our focus is DevOps. We'll also take a tour of the vulnerability landscape to better understand the building blocks we have to work with as part of our risk remediation. So here's a generic DevOps pipeline based on the Cloud Security Alliance. I added some additions at the bottom, a source code package repository, example for storing and scanning NPMs on intake. Our new vulnerability program that triages and makes decisions about new vulnerabilities, and our bug bounty program. So here we have labeled 7 tools and services that detect vulnerabilities or CVEs in our pipeline. Pop quiz time. According to the DevOps handbook, there's 3 ways. What's the first way? The first way is flow or systems thinking. So what's our system? Well, as an organization, the value we deliver to our customers is delivered via software, which flows through our pipeline, which is developed by developers, and more recently GPTs. And I, as a security person, exist to enable the flow of that software to the pipeline, balanced with security risk. As a CISO, I want to know risk and remediation per asset and for the organization. And as a developer, I don't care about your security tool or team. I care about delivering software of high assurance quickly. And as a developer or leader, I want a unified, prioritized, personalized, achievable view of what to fix first. I was at the AppSec conference here earlier in the year, and there was a keynote talk about winning the war in cyber. And the speaker asked what it is that people wish for, and there was various existential topics thrown out, and one person said, well, I wish developers would fix the security issues. And there was a murmur of support. And I thought to myself, what is it I'm doing to help developers fix the security issues? So now we're going to take a brisk walk through the vulnerability landscape to understand our building blocks we have to work with. So we have CVEs, which are vulnerabilities that are a list of records for publicly known cybersecurity vulnerabilities. They are enriched by the National Vulnerability Database that uses the CVSS, Common Vulnerability Scoring System Standard, to add scores. And that CVSS data is used by the EPSS, Exploit Prediction Scoring System, to determine the probability of exploit for a given CVE. It's the same group that maintain the CVSS standard and EPSS. Linked to NVD is CSICEV, known exploited vulnerabilities, And bottom left, we have CISA SSVC, Stakeholder-Specific Vulnerability Categorization. And the more observant of you will have noticed that SSVC is CVSS spelled backwards, which is interesting if you're proposing an alternative to a standard. So what are these CVEs? Well, we can see there's a lot of them, and the rate is increasing, trending towards 30K by end of year. Looking in more detail, we see that the base score for our friend Log4Shell, the gift that keeps on giving, is 10. We can see the parameters that make up that base score. And bottom right, we can see the permutations or options for those parameters. On the top, we can see the link to CISA-Kev. Okay, pop quiz. We can see that Log4Shell has a score of 10 and we know it's widely exploited. So the question is the CVSS score a good predictor of exploitability? Okay, in other words, if I give you a random selection of scores and ask you to tell me which ones were exploited or not, would you be able to tell me better than guessing? Show of hands if you think yes. Show of hands if you think no. Smart crew. Yeah, so CVS score, not a good predictor of exploitability, so don't use it alone to prioritize. So whether you look at different academic studies, industry analyst studies, or vendor studies, they all say the same thing. Moreover, Tenable goes on to say that if you do use it to prioritize, then you'll end up fixing the wrong things and not fixing the things that you should be fixing. Okay, looking at CISA-Kev. We saw it was linked to the NVD, and CISA maintains a source of vulnerabilities that have been exploited in the wild known as Kev. And why do they do that? Well, what they're saying is many vulnerabilities classified as critical are highly complex and have never been seen exploited in the wild. And they give a figure of less than 4%. That's in stark contrast to the previous guidance down below from 2019 that says if the CVSS is greater than whatever, fix it by whenever. So guidance is, if it's in the catalog, fix it. Here's what it looks like. Here's our friend Log4Shell. And on the top, we can see a related entry, which is for the vulnerability in the fix associated with Log4Shell. And interestingly, it was only entered in the catalog this month. Okay, looking at EPSS. So from the same group that bring us the CVSS standard, EPSS is estimating the likelihood or probability that a software vulnerability will be exploited in the wild. Goal is to assist network defenders in better prioritizing vulnerability remediation efforts in conjunction with an existing CVSS score. So CVSS is about the severity of the vulnerability. EPSS is about the more related to the threat aspect. You can see what it looks like in terms of the score, and you can download it for a CV or download the snapshot for a day. It's temporal, as in changes per day, unlike the CVSS score, which, as we saw for Log4Shell, is static. It's an ML model, and it takes ground truth from various intrusion detection systems. Definition is probability of observing exploitation activity in the next 30 days. From the user guide, it shows how to use it. So you can use it in conjunction with CVSS, as in if you're using CVSS, then you can use EPSS score as well. And you can start from the top scores, as in high EPSS score, high CVSS score, and work your way downwards. What's not clear from the guide, and what wasn't clear to me originally, until I did the data analysis and submitted to the EPSS special interest group, is that EPSS score is only useful for a small fraction or percentage of CVEs. And we'll talk more about that. So how to use it is, if it's got a high EPSS score, definitely be worried about it. If it's got a low EPSS score, you don't know. And most CVEs will have that low score, so it's not relevant there. As a second pass, you could say, well, if a CVE in my DevOps shows up in CISA-Kev, probably want to prioritize that too. Looking at SSVC. So goal of SSVC is to assist in prioritizing the remediation of a vulnerability based on the impact exploitation would have to a particular organization. And CISA, the same group that brought us CISA-Kev, encourages every organization to use a vulnerability management framework that considers a vulnerability's exploitation status. Pop quiz, survey. Hands up whose vulnerability management framework considers a vulnerability's exploitation status. Show of hands, yes? I'd say 2% of the audience. Okay, good to know. So we'll talk more about decision trees in detail later. So that's a very quick tour through the vulnerability landscape. So you now know more about the vulnerability landscape than many of your peers. So time for some tasty treats that I promised at the beginning, jumping into some data analysis. I like to understand things by back of the napkin order of magnitude. So I generated this Venn diagram on the right. So if we look at the population of all CVEs, there's approximately 200K. And approximately half of them have known exploits available. Example, entries in Metasploit, exploit DB, etc. And of those, approximately 10% are known actively exploited. The problem is there isn't a defined list of those CVEs that are known actively exploited. The percentages are approximately 5% of total CVEs known actively exploited. However, we do have a well-defined list in CISA-KEV, which is about 10% of that again. There's approximately 1,000 entries in CISA-KEV. Drilling down into CISA-KEV, we see that Google Project Zero, which is about zero-day exploits, is largely contained within CISA-KEV. And so while known exploit available is a good indicator of risk, as in better than a CVSS score, knowing that a CVE is being actively exploited is a whole lot better. Some other graphs then based on those populations. So we looked at all CVEs, the known exploit available, and the entries in CISA-KEV, 3 different populations. In general, we can see number of CVEs per year increasing, and the count of, I'll call them key and KEV, follows along. No real surprise there. If we look at CVEs by product, we see it's mainly operating systems and browsers. One note though, if you're looking at the CVEs in your DevOps pipeline and you're comparing the CISA-KEV, you might see something like, example, Oracle WebLogic Server associated with CVE and think to yourself, well, we're not using that, and think happy thoughts and say, well, we're not affected. But you could be affected if you're using the underlying open source dependency that has that vulnerability. So important to check from a DevOps point of view what piece of software or open source dependency is associated with that CVE. Don't dismiss it immediately. So looking at across those 3 populations again, the distribution of EPSS scores. EPSS is a machine learning model, which ML is opaque, so it's important to understand what it works. We don't have the data associated with the model, but we do have the outputs. So looking across the 3 populations, we can see approximately 6 to 7% of all CVEs have a high or useful EPSS score. Across known exploit available, slightly higher, and across KEV, it's about 50-50. Looking in more detail. So if we wanted to benchmark EPSS, it's all about the probability of exploitation in the next 30 days. So we need a data set that we know has been known exploited. So we can use CISA-KEV here. So the histograms are the counts across the different axes. And I created this plot and then I posted it to the EPSS special interest group. And there was some surprise and immediate questions about, well, okay, we expected the top band for the known exploited vulnerabilities. We'd expect that EPS detects them. That's its purpose. And even for on the right, I took all the alerts or CVEs from the alerts. They typically issue about 10 or 15 per year, which is the most known exploited vulnerabilities. And even for that population, there's a small little tail at the bottom where EPSS score is low. So the explanation, and it gets to the heart of how EPSS works, and it's what its sweet spot is. So KEV is probably a mix of vulnerabilities that EPSS has good visibility into, like widespread exploitation network vulns that can be detected with EPSS intrusion detection systems, and others that it doesn't. Okay? So EPSS score near 0 should not be taken as a low probability of exploitation. When I looked at it at the beginning, naively thinking happy thoughts, I thought, wow, all my CVs have suddenly been deprioritized, but that's not the case. So now moving into our DevOps data analysis. So one of the questions was, Do the 7 tools and services find the same CVEs? And in general, the short answer is no. Most CVEs are found by one tool only. That's relevant because when we look at the distribution of counts of CVEs across the CVE IDs, we see this Pareto type distribution, or what's called hockey stick. And normally Pareto is used in a business context, the 80-20 rule, as in you can get 80% of the way there with 20% of the effort. And same idea here, that if we were to address just the CVE IDs with the high counts, we would, get 80% of the way there quickly. For the data analysis, we see that we're in line with industry averages in terms of our proportion of CVSS scores are high. That's industry standard, and our most frequent score is 7.5. We see Paretos everywhere, whether it's due to one specific library and versions accounting for most CVEs, or as we talked about, the distributions. And we see correlations. We see 2.5 times more language B libraries than language A, but language A has the most CVEs by far. And it turns out that was due to that specific language, the dependencies being stale. And we obviously ran the correlation, and we can see that too. High correlation between counter CVEs and stale libraries. So the root cause and the root fix is to keep libraries updated. Okay, so when we're understanding our DevOps data, it's important to understand this, root causes. So pop quiz survey. How many people have this level of understanding of their DevOps pipelines and associated data related to CVEs? Show of hands. 0. Wowzers. So how to get it? Most vendors do a crap job in this area. I know that, and I tell vendors because I'm on several advisory boards. But here's how you do it. If you use data profiling, just export the files from your tools, run the profiling, and it generated all that data that we saw at the beginning. In fact, I gave an internal technical conference presentation on whichever tool and data, and the data analysis involved exporting 4 files, profiling it, and the hard effort was copy-pasting into a deck and making it look pretty. If somebody at a conference told me about this, I'd buy them a pint later on. This is very powerful, and it's a significant gap in the vendor market. Okay, risk remediation. So we asked the dumb question earlier, what's risk? So now we get to answer it. So according to NIST, risk is per asset and depends on impact of a vulnerability being exploited by a threat. Okay, that's good to know, but if I'm trying to figure out the risk associated with CVE, that doesn't help me much. I can't relate my data sources to that. So we need to go a step further. But before we do, as DevOps folks, we're interested in fixing things. So remediation is the other part of the picture. So the full picture is risk remediation. So looking at threat and doing a first principle analysis and breaking it down into its subcomponents. So on the right is what I wish existed when I started this effort, but didn't. It looks at the various data sources that we have and puts them into a taxonomy for threat. So to explain, looking at the likelihood of exploit, the biggest predictor of exploitation for CVE would be that if it was previously exploited in the organization, example, showed up in our incident response or bug bounty, then that's a good indicator it would be exploited again in the future. Or if it was known actively exploited in the wild, I'm going to use an entry in CSAKEV for that. Various vendor DBs provide additional data on that. And then there's EPSS score, which is a probability of exploitation. We saw earlier that it covers about 7% of CVEs, or we can use known exploit available, and so on. So this is a prioritized list of data sources for threat. If we look at impact, breaking it down, impact is very much business context dependent, and we can determine impact based on asset value or various other parameters. So yeah, very much organization specific. Looking at vulnerability, depends on runtime context. So as an example, Spring Shell depended on certain JDK versions, and if you weren't using them, you weren't vulnerable. Reachability analysis, sometimes you might be calling the vulnerable method, you may have the vulnerable method in dependency, but it's not being called. So that's where something like reachability analysis comes in, and so on and so forth. So these are all the parameters that contribute to the vulnerability. Remediation. So we want to know, is there a fix available? Is it a quick fix? Is it likely to break something? And typically we upgrade by package. Back when I started developing software in embedded, we were patching at the byte level. Now it's at the package level, much easier. Yeah, but remediation depends on your development context. Okay, so that's good. We have a risk taxonomy to inform for a CVE what is the risk associated with. But ultimately what we want to decide is, do I need to fix it now or do I need to fix it later? So this is where decision trees come in. So why decision trees? So they focus on what matters, risk and its constituent components, and what action or decision needs to be taken. They're very understandable, as in you can see on the right, we look at exploitation and we decide, is there active exploitation, is it proof of concept, or is there no exploitation? And we do our sort of CVE, choose your own adventure, and walk down the tree. They're modular. So CISA SSVC is very much nation-state critical infrastructure, not suited for enterprise organizations, so we can swap out that node and put in our own and come up with a high, medium, low. So many benefits to decision trees, also that they're debuggable. We were backtesting against our new vuln and bug bounty data, and it's very easy to look at the decisions that were made in the tree versus, let's say, what had been previously ranked in our other programs. So very debuggable and easy to understand what happened. So in a one-pager, this is SSVC. Don't worry about all the details, but the key point is that for each node, there's an explanation of what to do. So example, active is shared, observable, reliable evidence that the exploit is being used in the wild by real attackers, etc. And then you have decisions, which is kind of act or kind of, let's say, track it, keep an eye on it, but don't do anything. So I restructured the decision tree into something that I wanted. Had I wanted to change it completely, I would have put the risk on top. The most important stuff should be on top, but I kept fidelity with the existing SSVC tree. So what I did do is I split out the highest risk items. That's 2 red items at the bottom. In CISA SSVC, we would have had 4 pink ones. So I added an extra level because I'm most interested in the most risk stuff. And I changed the mission and well-being to 2 levels, but otherwise this is our decision tree. And so we get to see depending for CVE, if there's an exploit available or not, which decision we would land on. Do we act ASAP, act, etc. Okay, so that's cool. We have a risk taxonomy. We have a decision tree about, given the parameters, do we fix it now or later? And now we connect the 2 things together. So for exploitation active, we can see, is there a bug bounty entry? Did it show up in our incident response? Is it in CISA KEV? Is the EPSS score above the threshold, etc. And so we can see that here on our decision node, and we can see the values that we're referencing from the taxonomy. Similarly with automatable, if it's no user interaction required for the attack and it's low complexity, no or low privilege required, and it's network attack vector, then it's automatable. We use a vendor DB, which gives us more refined info, but it's similar. Technical impact, if it's high confidentiality or integrity impact, then it's a total, else it's a denial of service. Mission and well-being, as I said, very much a blank slate for your organization, but you come up with a high, medium, and low. Okay, so that's the risk taxonomy from first principles. Given a CVE, what are the measurements or parameters and data we can use to determine the risk for that CVE? Decision tree is about, okay, we know the risk, but do we need to fix it now or later or when? We get those decisions. We connect the 2 together, and now we're ready to test it. So before we do, here's what it looks like together. And if you can read that down the back, I'll buy you a pint. But this is a zoomed out view of our risk taxonomy, our prioritization decision tree, and our node inputs. It's available as open source. I like Plant UML, so the diagrams are available as source code. So feel free to contribute and make it better. All right. Okay, so we just built a risk-based prioritization decision tree, said no one ever. Time to test our real talents our talents in the real world, do you reckon, said Fred Weasley. So we need some test data. We've talked about some of it before. So this is our set of test data, whether we look at CVEs, known exploit available, or known exploited vulnerability. We're going to look at CISA-KEV. Are there any Harry Potter fans in the audience? Okay, so shout out a Harry Potter spell there, incantation. And just to avoid prompt engineering or attacks, make sure you don't turn us into frogs, right? That wouldn't end well, all right? Okay, so shout out prompt. Right, boom. If we look at our decision tree applied to the CISA-KEV top most exploited known vulnerabilities, we would see on the left would have been the old way of doing it, following the user guide or prioritizing by bands. On the right is color-coded our decisions. So we can see that even within that most known exploited vulnerabilities, we're getting targeting here. We're targeting, as in the red dots are spread out across the CVSS, which we know is not a good indicator or predictor of exploitability, and the EPSS score, which we know only gives coverage for a small percentage of CVEs. We're getting targeting for all the CVEs in that population. So we're seeing the reds, the oranges, and the pinks. And they're not arranged diagonally, but yet we're targeting them. All right, another spell.
It's Leviosa.
Leviosa, woo! All right, we'll discuss that one in the pub later. So just looking at the full population. Again, what we see is that we're targeting the CVEs that have been known exploited across the bands or across the diagram. If we were to use the traditional method, the diagonal method, we'd end up fixing a lot of pink and orange stuff before we got to the red stuff. That's the short and simple version of it. What we want to do is fix the most important things first, all right? And we can see we get this targeting of the most important things in this way. Okay, let's look at all CVEs. Another one. Shout it out. And what does that one do?
It's just
killing curse. Thanks, Les. If I drop dead. Okay, so this is all CVEs. And on the left, I showed whether there's a known exploit for those or not. And you can see it's largely spread across the population. And on the right, color-coded by the decision risk, do we fix it now, later, whatever, we see the bands. Similar pattern. We see that the reds, the most important things, are spread out across the CVSS score, the VUN score, and the EPSS score. Let's zoom in. We can see also what we'd like to see is there's a lot of green, as in track closely, and lots of blues, which we worry about later. That's nice. If we chop off the bottom bit and we look at EPSS greater than 0.1, the targeting becomes clearer. Again, we see the red. A lot of it is in that top corner, but not all of it is. And we want to get to the red stuff first, the highest risk things first. And we wouldn't if we use the other method of tracking by the diagonal or using bands. Okay, final spell, I think. Make it a good one. Make it count. Crucify. Kill. Instant death and crucify. I'm loving the happy vibes here. Please fill out a positive sentiment on the feedback form and don't use such. Okay, so this is real data from our DevOps pipeline. It doesn't matter if it's one tool or an aggregation of tools or whether it's one point in time or an aggregate. The pattern looks the same. So here we're looking at the CVSS score versus EPS score by the counts. And we can see, just looking at either, the CVSS score is spread out across the range, and there's a concentration of low EPSS score, also meaning that EPSS is not helpful for vast majority of our CVEs. But is for some, and that's where it's useful. So doing the traditional prioritization by bands or diagonals, we'd get something like this. But if we were to do it using our decision tree, what we get is the CVEs divided up into decision bands. Do we act ASAP, act, etc.? And we still retain our EPSS score for where it's useful. So we get that static decision associated with the various parameters that we use from our risk taxonomy into where we, using our decision tree, made these decisions about should we act ASAP, act, attend, etc. across our decisions 0, 1, all the way through. And we get to retain the EPSS score. So this is good, but what's better is that we get a gentle on-ramp. At the end of the day, it's still people fixing these CVEs. And we want to have, per our user story, an achievable amount of things to fix. Okay? And when we do this, we get this gentle on-ramp of things to fix, which gives that early, easy, valuable win, which is psychologically important for teams. And that comes courtesy of splitting out those top 2 decision nodes. I didn't know that at the time when I did it, but that's the way the data came out. So this is nice. We've taken a large population of CVEs and we've provided a targeted risk-based prioritization. So how do we run all this? Well, the threat and vulnerability aspects are automatable. That's generic data, taking the data from our tools, taking the data from the various vulnerability landscape databases, and updating it daily. And we get the decisions. Then we can layer in the asset impact and the business and runtime context. And finally, then there's the remediation context. You know, is it a quick fix? Is it a major refactor? All these things play in. Okay. We've covered a lot here. We started at top level context. We drilled down to cover the vulnerability landscape. You now know more about the vulnerability landscape than the vast majority of your peers. We built a risk remediation decision tree prioritization scheme from first principles, and we tested it with our test data. Takeaways. Know what matters most to you in your DevOps pipeline. Okay, and know your tools' sweet spots and blind spots. We saw from the survey where the result was 0. People generally don't have a good idea of the data in their pipelines. Do the EDA for that, please. Do yourself a favor. Vendors aren't going to help you here, but it's super easy to do. Know where your Paretos are, and know your risk taxonomy and the parameters that matter to you. Decision trees. Takeaways for our decision trees. They give more targeted prioritization, which is important. We need to know what do we need to fix first, okay? And they have benefits over the CVSS score, which, as we showed, is not a good predictor of exploitability, and over the EPSS score, which has relatively low coverage, as in no signal for most CVEs. We get the best of both worlds by retaining EPSS with our decisions, so we get that static component, and we get the temporal component that EPSS gives us. So if something changes in real time, EPSS will be updated. And we can use EPSS across our decision bands to prioritize. So even for Act ASAP, we could say, well, we'll prioritize within that band by EPSS score. And we get a risk-based SLA with sufficiently granular and understandable decisions. So now we have a unified, prioritized, achievable view across tools and teams of what to fix first. We can optimize our flow of value and software versus risk. The personalized part is a separate project I'm working on, perhaps another talk. Thank you. I have to say, B-Sides, Dublin crowd, you've been great. Thanks for the interaction, and we'll discuss the exact pronunciation of certain Harry Potter spells later in the Harbour Master. Any questions? How are we doing on time? Yep, I'm all yours. You can utter various other incantations that have impending debt. Please.
Have you adopted this already in Yahoo, or
we adopted it for one tool that I was rolling out just to see earlier on. We did a rough cut just to see what the data looks like, and now we're back testing it. It turns out that a lot of decision, as in how we hooked up the decision tree nodes, a lot of it was consistent with what we were doing in our new vulnerability program, where those are the folks in the trenches, who manually create the CVEs. Lisa is, a veteran and an expert in the space, but a lot of decision, let's say, shapes or decisions were similar to what we were doing in Nuvon. So it's not that significantly different ultimately. So yes, in that sense, and we've also back-tested against our Nuvon data and our bug bounty data. And what we will typically do is run it in parallel with our existing method and see how it comes out.
So like what was the difference?
The big difference is if you give developers or any team, as the company, a given team, and you give them 1,000 CVs and go fix that, nothing happens. You need an achievable amount. You need fix these 10 things, it gets done. Fix 1,000, you might as well give them 10,000, doesn't matter. The big difference is you have this targeted prioritization that gives an achievable amount of things to fix. That's the key difference. Yeah. Please.
So I'm curious about EPSS. You mentioned that it's a way to find how likely. Do you know what the major inputs are for that?
Yes. The major inputs, I probably have a slide on. So there is a bonus pack. Yeah, so these are the major inputs. Yeah.
When it's not, what do you personally use?
So we only use it to decide, it's one of the factors in deciding if there's active exploitation. So that's what we use it for. And then and also for then having made that decision in those decision bands using prioritization. But the other parameters that went into knowing is it known exploited are things like, as we said, if it showed up in our bug bounty incident response, if it was in CISA Kev, all those factors are an indication of exploitation. So there's many parameters for exploitation. A lot of them are static, and the kind of one of the unique benefits of EPSS is there's that temporal aspect. It changes over time. So if we don't have it, and we don't have it for a lot of them, it's not a big deal. We just don't end up using that parameter. We use the other ones.
Last question. Are you sharing the slides as well?
Yes, the slides will be shared. The thing is open source. So yes, I'd like feedback, folks. This is relatively new. I know from the EPSS special interest group, there's a lot of kind of interest in all these pieces. We're kind of blazing a trail, and I'd like other input on, from folks to shape this. It's a good time and place to be. So yeah, I'll share stuff to get feedback.
Just on the sharing of slides, and we will be getting the videos released on our YouTube channel, and where speakers permit us to use the slides, we'll collect those and we'll release them on B-Side's website as well.
Super. And maybe get a list, Paul, of the Harry Potter spells as well that we used in the... And no frogs were harmed in this. Go on. Sorry, go on.
Yeah, so first of all, I think the model is great. And I'm curious about, because the prioritization for the active exploitation CVs, it's great. But have you been able to quantify the compound benefit? Because most of the times when you patch that CV, you also get like a long tail of other things that are attached to it.
Yeah, so this is where the remediation comes in, and short answer, no. I haven't done the data analysis. I'd like to do a separate presentation on that because we upgrade at a package level, and it fixes lots of things. And ultimately, that's a whole presentation in itself and whole study. So maybe I'll be back next year to cover that. But that's my next area of interest. Yeah, it's a hard one to. I guess there's a lot of, let's say, research went into this. There's a similar amount of research to come up with that remediation. But watch this space. Shout time, folks, if I'm on time, whatever. 5 minutes, cool. Yep.
If you're going to, by the way, this is great. If you're going to use decision tree,
Mm-hmm.
and that means the traditional CVE might get ignored for a while.
Mm-hmm.
It's not applicable.
Mm-hmm.
How does that play with the compliance, audit, certification, SLA, when your auditor come in and you're like,
Sure.
well, yeah, it was a 10, but we decided based on our fancy,
Yeah, sure.
we're not going to do
So,
Talk me through that.
yeah, so in my previous existence 3 years ago, I worked in the payment card industry for 20 plus years. And PCI DSS, data security standard, says if it's CVSS 4 or greater, fix it. All right? So you got to fix it. I was involved in various, let's say, PCI boards and all that, but in general, PCI moves slowly. Let's just say that. So, and the other important aspect is, if you look at the Venn diagram of compliance and security, the overlap is a lot less than most people think. So you can still use all this to prioritize the stuff you fix within that compliance band CVSS 4 and more, because there's going to be a lot of stuff, so you need to prioritize it. So you can use it there. But for compliance, you may still need to fix more than 4. What I found, and I used to do certifications for or separate company, separate devices, so work with certification bodies, PCI boards, and all that. Depending on the auditor, if you can show that this makes sense, then they may be amenable to this. I know what's written in the standard, you know, there may be some wiggle room depending on, how convinced they are of this. And as it matures, like, so what's in the EPSS, like we're talking about discussions about, you know, should we engage with CISA, PCI, etc., to introduce this new way. Because the flip side is a lot of that stuff doesn't necessarily get fixed. It might get fixed for audit, you know, but then it doesn't get fixed because there's too much of it.
So do you think in the next 5 to 10 years, the industry might go more this direction?
Yeah, like if you look at what's out there, so CVSS doesn't work, right? In terms of prioritization and in terms of fix everything more than 4. That's silly, but it's what exists. Things are going to change. You saw a US government agency, CISA, come up with a much more pragmatic approach. In other words, we think you should focus on the most known exploited things. Here's the list, fix them by this date, and here's the decision tree so that you can focus on the exploitation status, which none of us do. So it's moving that way. Yes. It'll take time. So it's kind of talks like this and folks, getting an interest, will move it along. Yep.
So you're right that most people just look at CVSS and then 99% of people does. So what would you say the 80-20, like what should they do that's easy to do that's better than that? I mean, because you presented a lot.
Yeah, so in practical terms, if all you have is CVSS, then follow the user guide for EPSS and start with that. Problems, knowing its sweet spots and blind spots. If that's all you can do, and then CSECEV would be the other one. So focus on the security aspect. The compliance says if you fix it more than 4, or have CVS more than 4, you're good. But you should be more worried about the security aspects. So I would use EPSS, and if your CV shows up in CSECEV, use those types of things to prioritize. You get a lot of value from that first step approach, and you don't need to go off making decision trees just on that. So understand the limits of that, but it's much better than using CVSS alone. A good first step, basically.
Any considerations in terms of scaling this? Would you change anything depending on the complexity of your tool or product?
Well, so in terms of remediation, possibly there's the things like, the decision tree might say, well, act ASAP, but reality factors, a product, maybe you can't fix it immediately or whatever. All that plays into it there, but that's kind of later stage. In terms of this, not really. I mean, what you're looking at is given a CVE, what's the decision? Do we need to fix it? And that's generic a product. Then you get into the more product aspects. What's the asset value and things like that? That gets a bit more gray. That's tweakable in the sense that you're going from, let's say, binary decisions to what's the value of this thing, but somebody somewhere needs to know the value of those things. That stuff would likely tweak, but using those things as input parameters probably wouldn't. It's like the decision tree, like we saw the graphs, we saw the data, to run it on millions of data inputs it runs very quickly, the automated parts. We're out of time, so okay? We're out of time. Last one or out of time? You tell me. Your call. Okay, last one.
How does your model take into account fixed
Yeah, so that's not part of the decision tree, the risk part. The remediation would, as I said, is there a fix available? Is it a quick fix? What's the merge confidence? All those factors need to play into actual fixing it. Well, if the fix is not available, then you can look at the compensating controls. And so you go down the list. You can't fix it. Can we come up with compensating controls, or do we pull the plug? Whatever that list is. Okay. You've been a wonderful audience, folks. Thank you very much.